So thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this very exciting event. I'm super excited, but I was just telling Edie Justine that, it's always nerve-wracking a little bit to be in a public forum, right? And trying to make sense of a topic that's really, really important in my heart. But I think for everyone who works at ADB that cares about development, I think this rethinking poverty is a topic that is worth our time. So, in thinking about the history of poverty alleviation in the region, we have a lot to be proud of, right? The 1.5 billion people out of poverty in the past 2 generations, something that we often refer to, and the poverty rate decreasing from 75% to 10% in 1 generation, also amazing, right? So these are all the things that we should celebrate, but then there's also the kind of things that we have to be very cognitive of, and maybe a dose of reality. Through COVID, we have seen the fragility of poverty, right? 70 million people going back into poverty because of the loss of jobs, of the increase in healthcare, and other implications that comes with COVID-19. And what is even more interesting for me, but also sobering, is 2 aspects of poverty that I think about a lot. So the first one is about statistics, right? And so thank you, Karen, for sharing with me the poverty data for the Philippines. And one example that really struck me was that the Philippines, the poverty threshold, it's 13,873 pesos for a family of 5. So if this is your threshold for measuring people who are below the poverty line, what does that tell us about defining poverty, right? And what does statistics actually tell us about, what real poverty is, and how is this benchmarking really measuring poverty in a country? But the second piece is also equally important. It's about poverty not being kind of singular reference from the income perspective, right? It's very multidimensional in nature, right? We're not just talking about, the income levels, but we're also talking about 500 million people with no access to clean water, over 1 billion people without access to sanitation. And let me now start with quality of things, right? Quality of services, quality of education, quality of healthcare. So these are all the kind of things that makes it even more complex in terms of a topic. And so that's why I'm super excited, because we have a panel who's going to help us really navigate through some of these complex questions. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panel, starting with our own executive director, Justine, who's member of the board of directors, representing the Philippines, Kazakhstan, Maldives, Marshall Islands, Mongolia, Pakistan, Timor-Leste. So I read it, yes. This part I did not memorize. A super academic background. I don't think I know anyone who has more degrees. So PhD in business administration, also master's in management and economics, as well as a bachelor's in economics from the University of the Philippines. Past president of the Philippines Economics Society and a research fellow at the Philippines Institute for Development Studies. So, but most importantly, and we have a lot more interaction because she is currently serving as a chair for the Development Effectiveness Committee on the board, a very important function to really keep us honest. And her research prior focused on pricing policies for publicly provided private goods, as well as effects of decentralization on spending patterns of local government units, and has done a lot of consultancies around with other institutions, including the World Bank, UNICEF, and UNSCAP, on social protection and public financial management. Next, we have Katie Rowland, who works as a senior fellow, research fellow, and co-deputy director at the Center for the Study of Global Development at the Open University, which is the largest university in the UK, and it's an honorary associate at IDS. She is also author of The Empathy Fix: Why Poverty Persists and How to Change It, and founder and host of the podcast Poverty Unpacked, exploring the hidden sides of poverty in conversation with broad range of experts. So Katie has also a PhD in public policy and has been working in the field of poverty, social policy, and international development for nearly 2 decades. Widely published academic journals and books, and her work has been featured in media such as The Guardian and BBC World Service. Next, we have Dr. Aniceto Orbeta, but I just learned before today, just conversing with Dr. Orbeta, that his nickname is Babes, which I love. So yeah, and I think I might use that during the Q&A session. But Dr. Orbeta is the current president of the Philippines Institute for Development Studies, and I think Justine's a little bit nervous because, yeah, ex-boss. Where he has served as a senior research fellow since 1992. He is an economist specialized in applied economic modeling, impact evaluation, education and labor market, social protection, demographics, economics, and information and communications technologies, which is a wide range of topics. He led the education and labor policy research team that identified reforms, including, and this is something I'm going to completely butcher, so the Patawid Pamiyang Filipino program. 4 Ps. I should have just said 4 Ps. A Universal Access to Quality Tertiary Education Act, or free tuition law, amongst others. He is considered one of the country's pioneers in impact evaluation research. It's also a field that I'm super interested in. His expertise in impact evaluation has been widely sought by various international organizations, including the ADB, AUSAID, Innovation for Poverty Action, International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, MCC, as well as the World Bank. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Philippines School of Economics, and he also did a postdoctoral studies at Harvard University. Last but certainly not the least, we have Dr. Tina, who says, just say Dr. Tina because I can butcher the name. She is an associate professor at the University of Philippines, Los Baños, specializing in social policy, social protection systems, and poverty alleviation strategies. Her research expertise centers on conditional cash transfers, which I know that ADB has done a few, gender dimensions of social protection, as well as institutional mechanisms for poverty reduction in developing countries. So she is currently the co-principal investigator for understanding attitudes, countering stigma, and cultivating empathy to tackle poverty and inequality, which is a collaborative project with the Center for Study of Global Development in the UK. In fact, she comes to us today, having been in the field last week with Katie in Laguna. So Tina has a PhD in international development from Nagoya University in Japan, and she maintains a visiting associate professorship at Tsuda University in Japan. So welcome, panel. Really excited about this. And so with this, I'm going to sit down with the panelists to start the Q&A session. So Yidi Justine, inevitably we start with you. So being the chair of the DEC and serving the board of directors, perhaps you'll be in a very good position to share with the audience a good overview of ADB's role and a perspective from the board on this topic in terms of how we think about poverty. And I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Lou, and thank you so much for coming. Thank you for this invitation. I have 3 points, like on the board. Every joint statement we have, hopefully 3 points. Sometimes it goes up to 7 points. But in any case, so poverty reduction is a fundamental element of ADB's mandate to foster economic growth and cooperation in the region, and to contribute to the acceleration of process of economic development of developing member countries in the region, not just individually, but also regionally across the region. Second, we must ensure that our investments are sustainable and that they promote long-term social, economic, and environmental outcomes. And our approach to poverty reduction extends beyond just income poverty. We recognize that poverty is multidimensional, affecting people in diverse ways. It's not just about lack of income, but deprivation in other key aspects of well-being like health, education, living standards, employment, empowerment, and so on. So poverty is multidimensional. We're recognizing it now, and maybe Dr. Babes, I'm passing it to him, can later discuss, because PIDS has done a lot of work on multidimensional poverty also. But let me share to you what I did before I joined the board. So in 2021, I led a team for UNICEF. You're right, I did consultancies for all other MDBs, IFIs. ADB, for some reason, wouldn't hire me. Anyway, that's a joke. So I led a project in 2021 for a shock-resistant social protection system for the Ministry of Social Services and Development in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. I helped develop an operations manual for the social protection cash transfer programs of Bangsamoro. But at the same time, one of our tasks was to develop a poverty and vulnerability registry, particularly for the region, because they have nuanced vulnerabilities. Some things would keep them from being able to get the transfers that they need. Sometimes there were clan wars. And this was captured in that registry that we also piloted. And Dr. Toots Albert, another colleague, was the one who helped me with this particular thing. But specifically for ADB work, just last week, I took the board on a familiarization visit to Puerto Princesa in Palawan, to learn about upcoming work we will be doing on the blue economy, but also to speak to beneficiaries from 2 programs that ADB works on. The first is the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, the 4 Ps, for education and maternal health. So this is a cash transfer program that targets the poorest of the poor, which are identified through our listahanan. Okay, so listahanan is our registry for that. But these are the poor. And we learned from the program beneficiaries and witnessed, in my view, how the sustainable impact of this program was, with the story of 2 mothers whose children had graduated from the program, but who themselves were empowered to study again. One of the mothers became a licensed teacher at the State U in Palawan. Another one became a research enumerator at the Philippine Statistical Authority. And when they were asked, do you regret being graduated for the program? They said no, because someone else will benefit from this. So I saw how this had empowered them, and I think that's a sustainable impact in itself. Now, one of the actual child graduates became a licensed teacher herself. So she's a licensed teacher teaching also in Palawan. But another example of the work that we do is the Job Start program. So I brought also our board members to talk to the beneficiaries. This one targets another vulnerable population segment of our population, they were known before as out-of-school youth. Now I know that's no longer the proper term. Okay, the proper term now is not in education, employment, or training youth. And that's within a certain range. And they are sought out through a national local government coordination. We have this officer that ADB actually helped institutionalize through a PBL. And we're still working on that. And they are taught, if they're eligible, if they seem to really be wanting to be part of this, they're taught soft core skills. And I thought this was brilliant because it's not just technical skills that you need. You also need soft and core skills to be able to succeed, become, in life. So we also highlighted in that program the value or the role of the private sector. In this case, it was Astoria Palawan, who offered employment opportunities to those who had graduated from the Job Start program. And the beneficiaries we spoke to were from out-of-school youth. They became managerial levels already in their different fields. So The last point that I have is that the board approved the midterm review of our strategy 2030, and thanks to Lou, we approved our corporate results framework as well last year. And for the first time, we've set a target of 75% of our operations to be directly supporting poverty reduction and inclusiveness by 2030. We're also pursuing ambitious targets for development outcomes achieved through these investments in human capital. So thank you.
Thank you, Edie Justine. I think those are really good examples of effective programs in the Philippines. And thank you for pointing out the target as well. And I know that part of it is about establishing targets, and then there's the implementation and rolling out. So, and this is something that we're working very closely with our team on the ground to really operationalize this, which is going to be important. Next one I have, I'm going to go to the far end of the panel and ask Katie to talk a little bit more about the global trends on poverty, social protection, as well as anti-poverty interventions, because I think it's important to kind of like have that context, right? And being where you said, please share with us what are some of the global trends that you see and observe.
I think it should work now. Great. I also have 3 points in keeping with the previous speaker. Before I get to those, just a very brief global overview of where we stand in terms of poverty. Some numbers have already come across to the audience. So when we look at the SDGs, end poverty and extreme poverty, the low poverty rate of $2.15 a day, we currently stand at 400 million people around the world still living in poverty. If we look at the higher poverty rate of $6.85 a day, which is the upper middle income poverty line, that jumps up to 3.5 billion, and that's 44% of the world's population. So yes, we have made massive achievements when looking at these income-based rates, but we are also still looking at 1 in every 2 persons across the globe living at least in some form of deprivation. And we just heard about the Philippines and how low the income poverty rate here is. If you use the $6.85, 2021 data says the poverty rate is 55%. So you can see how much difference the use of different poverty rates makes. Now, on to my 3 points. The first one links to what has already been said about the multidimensionality of poverty. We still use the income measures a lot for good reason, but we also recognize poverty is multidimensional. That's now part of the SDGs. It's one of the targets, which says by 2030, reduce at least half of the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions. So there's the scope there for countries to develop, as was mentioned, and also use those national definitions. Now, Asia as a region has always been at the forefront of these kinds of initiatives. In Bhutan, the Gross National Happiness Index has its roots in the 1970s and was actually ingrained in the constitution in 2008. And also Vietnam was at the forefront of developing a multidimensional child poverty index, and their multidimensional poverty is being monitored on a regular basis. But if we look at countries across the region, at national level, the efforts to monitor multidimensional poverty aren't as well advanced, I would say, as they might be in other regions. So for example, in Latin America, Colombia, Mexico, Panama, they all use multidimensional measures alongside income-based measures to understand what the trends are in poverty. In this region, Vietnam does that, Pakistan does that, but there are a few other examples. So there is still some leeway to be made there. Okay, my second point, and this moves on to social protection, and also to what has been mentioned in part already about conditional cash transfers. So we've seen cash transfers especially expanded a lot in the last 2 decades. But alongside that, we see that there's been a lot of comprehensive support added on to cash transfers, or sometimes other forms of singular supports. And that follows the logic from multidimensional poverty as well. We recognize that income is important, but many families and people living in poverty need other support as well. So whether that's skills training, as Justine mentioned, or whether that might be referrals to other services, or indeed other types of economic supports. Conditional cash transfers are one type of program, and the 4P program has been mentioned. Other types of programs that have become really popular are so-called economic inclusion programs, like the graduation program in Bangladesh, which was groundbreaking and has been implemented across the world. So that's one component, one trend that we see in social protection. The other one is around shock responsive social protection. So the recognition, on the one hand, that social protection is vital for families to withstand the polycrisis that we see around us and an increasing number of shocks that people have to deal with. And I think in this region, especially climate shocks are at the forefront of people's minds. But shock responsive social protection is also about having systems that are able to change, to expand, to be agile, so that when a shock occurs, or even before it occurs, it can adapt and make people more resilient. And there's a lot of investment in that type of social protection across the world at the moment. And then the third point I want to make in terms of trends around poverty is that we recognize that poverty comes in multiple forms. This is about multidimensional poverty as well as income poverty, but it's also often concentrated in groups that have multiple markers of disadvantage. If you are a woman who lives in a rural area, who is disabled and of an ethnic minority, the disadvantage and inequality that you experience is compounded compared to when you are either one of these, or if you're a poor male living in an urban area. And it's important to understand how these inequalities intersect, because otherwise it is too easy to be left behind by some of the interventions and the projects, for example, that ADB supports. It's very tempting for projects to focus on, for the lack of a better word, low-hanging fruits, people who are close to the poverty line. But by doing that, you miss those who experience deep and chronic poverty, who are often there because they experience intersecting inequalities.
Thank you very much. That was really, that was a lot of rich information in terms of the overview on the comprehensive support in terms of social protection, but also looking at the shock. What was it that you said? It was shock?
Shock responsive.
Response.
Yeah.
Shock responsive.
Social protection.
Social
absolutely.
protection, which is the first time I've heard it. But it's very, very relevant, as well as, you know, leaving no one behind in that way. And I think this is a good segue into Babes, Dr. Babes Orbeta. That's probably like the most awful way of saying it. But I think you bring with you a lot of experience from the Philippines Institute of Development Studies. And so with respect to this topic, what do you see as the biggest data gaps in understanding poverty and inequality trends, not only in the Philippines, but also across the region? And you know, we at ADB are always interested to know how we, as well as research institutes such as yourselves, can collaborate to fill these gaps.
Thank you for having me and that questions. I think the data gaps to me is not much on trends and all that. So let me explain my point. So I think the gaps is really understanding what countries have and how what country collects and why some are not collected, for instance, and what types of analysis are actually done on this. And I think those are the gaps to me. Analysis, you may have data not used for analysis, and segue to that is more importantly is how does this result of the analysis inform policy and program design? So those are the gaps to me, and you may have data but didn't transform into actionable information, and you may have actionable information which you didn't ask, so nothing happens. So there's a long way between data and action, and what's more important for a researcher like me is the learning part of it. What have we learned from what we have been doing, all the data that we have, and how it enrich our decisions or inform our decisions. So how data support action is really the critical gap to me. That means maintaining a discipline and consistent measurement and transparency in reporting progress or the lack of thereof, which sometimes in the Philippines, as you may know, people like to hide lack of progress for certain reasons or for obvious reasons. So the other thing that gap is really on how data enables real-time policy adjustments, because oftentimes data come late and everything is already done. You cannot do anything anymore. So how fast can we use whatever available data to readjust, because we are not going in the direction where they're going, is a very important data that or information that should be given to policymakers. So we should go just beyond trend analysis, but reflect on the systemic limitations of how data actually supports action. That's because that's the importance of data, is to prompt action and to have better action, essentially. So makes you act and makes you act better, essentially. That's to me is the but I would like to go beyond just informing, but letting data make us understand which ones work. I think that's more consequential to me. Being informed that somebody is poor is important, but knowing how to deal with his case is much more important to me. And that's where we are actually, say, not doing very well. We don't have real validated solutions to what to do given a certain situations. We have records of here and there that it works in certain areas, but it doesn't work in other areas. What works in the Philippines, for instance? That's what's important to me. We already know, like, for example, multidimensional poverty. That's why we are no longer surprised that single intervention doesn't work, because the poor is facing so many risks. So that's why the graduation program is proven to have. Karen can tell you that. I know Karen can tell you that from his heart. That works for the extreme poverty. But one other thing that we know about that program is that's very expensive. So if you are less than extreme poverty, what do you do? Because poverty is not just extreme. There are several layers of poverty. What do you how do you deal with those people? The other thing that we need access to services. And the brute force solution is provide facilities. But that requires resources, requires time, especially in marginalized areas where it's very difficult to build facilities and equip them. What do you do in the meantime? For a very important question for me that's hanging on my head is whether the indigent health insurance program of the Philippines is really providing access to the poor. These are financed by subsidy of government. But nobody has yet convinced me that that has increased access for health services for the poor. That has to be, or even the newer one. I already know that the vouchers program or the free tuition subsidies are not subsidizing the very poor. So that's the. So those are the data gaps to me. Knowing what works in specific situation is a very important information, because knowing that someone is poor should encourage you to understand how to deal with that, with the situations, and deal with it much more effectively. And there are solutions in other countries. We should try it here, and know for ourselves that this one work or doesn't work in the Philippines for certain reasons, and that should what it should be. That's those kind of information we need have to have. Yeah.
And super rich amount of information, and I love the the 2 points that you make in terms of how data supports action and how data enables policy adjustment. Because I know that this is something that we also face at ADB, in terms of how relevant is how well we're learning, right, from previous projects and experiences. But I have more questions for you, babes. So we'll be definitely coming back to you on this. But next for Tina. We obviously have a very strong partnership in the Philippines, and so I wanted to bring you in to ask about your experience in development policy and in the field. What are some of the key policy reforms the ADB should be advocating for to ensure that social protection programs are in fact addressing this issue of poverty reduction?
Okay. My responses would be based not only on the research that we have conducted, but also building on the research that has been conducted on social protection. In fact, we're also in the process of doing some kind of like meta-synthesis of different social protection research here in the Philippines. Apparently, there have been like 300, 400 research on social protection in the last 10 years. But let me draw you into 5 themes. I'm breaking away with the 3 themes that I see that it's really important to take note in terms of research and policy. So first, I'd like to build on to what has been mentioned on shock responsive social protection, but I'd like to add the word institutionalization. Because, well, here in the Philippines, there are a lot of recurring crises. So climate shocks, economic crisis, and it really pushes a lot of households into poverty again and again. So it's kind of like we should have a mechanism to really anticipate and respond into these shocks rather than just being in a way what you call this, like passively responding to it while it happens. So what we can do about this, and maybe this is something that ADB can also think about, is that if, for example, here in the Philippines, there's a lot of legal frameworks that we can actually look into, and maybe look into the possibility of enabling automatic expansion of benefits during declared emergencies, and maybe also looking at the budget flexibility. Here in the Philippines, I think it's really a challenge whenever this certain crisis strikes. The fiscal or the budget should have at least rapid allocation within those fiscal years that that is covered by certain crisis and vulnerability. And I think it's also very important to raise at this point that emergency response should also have simplified verification procedures, especially for social protection. Much of our work in the local government see that a lot of the beneficiaries are having a hard time of going through administrative burdens in order to access a lot of the assistance available in local governments. Second, I want to focus on reforming the targeting system and maybe looking at the coverage approaches. So a lot of the studies are also pointing out that vulnerability can also happen to those non-poor households that may actually fall into the cracks whenever there is the certain disasters or certain calamity. So with this, I think we can think about on dynamic targeting systems. I think there has been also approaches on stress testing social protection, how much of our social protection programs can really absorb certain vulnerabilities. And I think Katie has also mentioned on specializing approaches on specific vulnerabilities, such as the elderly, persons with disability, and other unique vulnerabilities. we're working with a lot of local governments, and I think strengthening governance and accountability mechanisms is also as important. And if we try to look at it in a local government, not exactly that when you go to the Social Welfare and Development Office, that's where you can access much of the programs. Actually, it is scattered all over the structure of the local governments. So I think we should promote on reforms on clarifying the roles and responsibilities, and maybe also looking at adoption on anti-corruption measures when we're looking at social protection. I would like to add as well on participatory monitoring and evaluation. It's very important that we engage the beneficiaries, their lived experiences, and also looking at what other experiences that they may have that usually program designers may overlook. I think there have been mentions as well on graduation pathways. That is really important, where we can link safety nets with sustainable livelihoods. I think it's very important to link social assistance with economic inclusion and other labor market programs, while thinking, of course, keeping climate resilience and gender equality in the background. And maybe for the final point that I would like to raise is that to enhance financing and fiscal sustainability, a lot of the studies still point that inadequate benefit levels limit the poverty reduction impact. So I think it's very important that at least in the Philippines, there already been guaranteed budget allocations for social protection, but I hope that it continues to be generous and basically just to consolidate. There's a lot of fragmented programs, so at least it's very important to put it all together, to improve efficiency, and of course to develop other social insurance mechanisms that can complement other tax-funded safety nets. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think you point out that some of the things that are important, right, when you actually have a fragmentation in terms of the approach to solving this problem, you may lose a bigger picture of what you're trying to achieve. And I think you also, touch upon this idea, when you have a program, how do you ensure that it's actually serving its purpose, right? And what are you monitoring? How are you learning from this experience? And this kind of brings me to a question back to Babes in terms of, your experience with impact evaluation and sort of, how are you going to learn unless you actually have measured the impacts of previous projects? This is something that we think a lot about, as well as we talk a lot about in terms of what we can do at ADB in evidence-based policies, right? Which look at reducing poverty effectively, as well as reducing inequality across our DMCs. What are your thoughts on this point?
Thank you. I think ADB has a unique combination of two key assets. One, of course, is the substantial financial resources, which also enables it to harness world-class analytical expertise. The other one is really its deep operational engagement with developing member countries through its lending programs. So giving it the direct exposure to real-world development challenges. So these two assets of ADB, resources and first-hand experience, places it as in a powerful position to promote evidence-based policy solutions, particularly addressing poverty and inequality. Your experience, direct experience with developing member countries allows you to identify development problems, and you have the resources to deploy rigorous impact evaluations to generate evidence on what works. I think that's generating evidence of what works is what you should be doing. You have the resources for that, and which most small research institutions like BIDs don't have, and disseminate these findings. So I think the the first, you already mentioned that the first target of your evidence is your own operations. You should dig deep into your own operations and learn on your own, from your own, which one works before like it works in this country, what works in the other country, and all. You have a tremendous opportunity to distill the learnings from different countries and why it works in this situation and not in the other situations, for instance. That's the identifying the perhaps from distilling from what you have been doing, root causes as well as Bible interventions. That's the thing that that gives ADB an advantage. You're exposed to different conditions. You have the resources to extract learning from those operations and disseminate. Of course, you have one of the best dissemination outfits money can buy. So that's I think generating knowledge is a very important, and with that knowledge you have to engage with national governments and local analysts so that you will be able to help them navigate the local research institutions like this can help you navigate political and institutional barriers that often prevent evidence from being translated into action. That's what I always remember that and experience this firsthand, is that there's a very strong three I's in governments, which is ideology, ignorance, and inertia. So basically, ignorance and inertia. People don't want to change what they're doing, and they have to be confronted with very solid evidence that something works. And even with that, sometimes you don't. So that's a fight. So basically, that's a fight. So you have to have a very strong conviction that you want to make development happen. So you, like for example, I've been chastised by our own legislators for sponsoring certain things, and that's part of my job, essentially. Publicly chastised by legislators. But if you want development to happen, you should argue for your point, essentially. So that's I think, that's very strong, and I feel it from personal experience. So unless you have very strong evidence and you can show them in a very understandable ways that this thing works, they will not do anything. Just continue with, like for example, the recent brouhaha about ACAP. It's basically trying to what do you call this, to the cash transfers. Should we, to me it's a question whether should be science-based about targeting or personality-based. Of course I will always, but yes. But some people said that, or some people even question, should we target or not? Everybody's paying taxes anyway. So that's still, you should be surprised, that's still a debate in this country. Should we be targeting or not? So that's the thing that you are facing. And if you are not convinced that you should do something for development to happen, then maybe you just keep silent and all that.
Well, being American, I have nothing to say at this moment. So, yeah. Very sobering points, and I love the three I's because I think we can all agree that also applies to ADB. No, I mean, stop laughing. No, I mean, I think it's a very important point about, having the conviction to do the right thing and to really have that compass that we have in terms of why we're here at ADB. In terms of, I'm going to go back to Tina, because after all this thinking through the impact evaluations and what we have to do, I want to kind of go back to this whole idea about social protection, right? In terms of the experience that you have in digital financial services and how they become, especially in our day and age, how they become a much more useful tool to really facilitate delivery of social protection. Can you just talk a little bit more about the challenges around this field and how, you know, in terms of delivery, but also in terms of you know, what we should do to measure and to scale up these kind of innovations?
Okay, so I think it's really worth starting on looking at what were the gains of digital finance or digital payments, for example, in social protection. I think in COVID-19, during the time of the COVID-19, I think we've really seen how it reduced distribution time and costs compared to manual cash disbursements. I think social protection programs has been also a very powerful tool for financial inclusions as well, because we can see that there's really an increase on bank account ownership among beneficiaries. And of course, digital systems in principles should help on reducing leakage and corruption by, you know, by minimizing the cash handling. However, beyond those benefits, I'd like to point into certain critical challenges that we may have looking at digitalization and social protection. I think digital infrastructure gaps remains very substantial. There's a lot of geographical disparities here. There's a lot of remote and rural areas that do not have reliable communication, infrastructure, electricity, and even financial service providers. So there's a lot of cases where beneficiaries have to travel long distances just to get or access their funds. And I think alongside with that, and I think there's also evidence here in the Philippines that digital literacy among vulnerable population remains to be low. There's also gender disparities, especially on mobile phone ownership among women and other digital literacy affecting how women access these benefits. So basically, if the beneficiaries cannot understand how to use these digital tools, even the well-designed systems wouldn't be that impactful. The third one, this is really interesting for me because in as much as we want that our beneficiaries will be financially included, but if you look at the financial system, the idea of knowing your customer requirements is really important. And we've seen in the field that identification and documentation remains to be a challenge among marginalized populations. Even birth certificates, for example, although I'm not sure if the banks would really require that, but this is something that is really lacking among potential beneficiaries. So I think we're seeing here kind of like a debate where you want to maintain financial integrity, but at the same time, the goal of social protection is to maximize inclusion. So I guess there's a fundamental tension between, you know, the financial regulatory objectives and what social protection aims to meet. And then, of course, I'd like to anchor on the things that are hard to change and actually on the bureaucratic processes. If you go to local governments and how they disburse some of the social assistance, they still use checks because this is for check and balance. And basically vouchers is still a thing on doing accounting because I think it's really an audit challenge in most local governments. So I think while we want an innovation, but I think bureaucratic structures in many public sector institutions, digital services may actually potentially disrupt their long established processes. So I guess those are the challenges that I see.
And I guess resistance, right? In terms of, you know, what we have always done, and so that comfort zone is always like a challenging part, you know, in the face of transition. So, but it also points to a lot of things that, you know, ADB can actually tackle, right? And this is for also Babe's, you know, your points about what ADB should be doing versus what you're saying about the gaps in the digital infrastructure and the such. So let me come back to Justine. After hearing Babes talk about sort of the gaps as well as the what ADB should and could do, and and also some further information that we got on the digital infrastructure. What can we do to foster our effective partnerships with governments, with the private sector, with non-NGOs, other MDBs, to make sure that our projects which are being developed are inclusive but also resilient in terms of all the challenges that we're facing in terms of poverty?
So thank you for that question. And before I answer it, I'm going to put on my researcher hat because there were very interesting discussions here today. Yes, I've seen Sir Babes been held in contempt at Congress a couple of times because of what he had said may or may not have been favorable. With respect to tuition subsidizing, I'm very interested also in the result of that because my undergraduate thesis was actually increasing user fees for state universities and colleges precisely because of the incidents. It's not the poor that really benefit from it. It's more of the middle higher income. And the way to do it, my suggestion was, that was decades ago when you were first a PIDS fellow, was that you have to improve basic education and the provision of its services in order to be able to get them to get to the good universities. So that was my thesis at the time. With respect to the shock responsive social protection, so the project that I mentioned that we did in BARM was the vulnerable and poverty analysis. So there was multidimensional poverty, and one of the concerns there was because of the nature of their religion, there were times that there were clan wars that people in remote areas couldn't access services. So it kept them from that. So when we we use a proxy means test method. When we piloted it, poverty incidence was higher than what it was stated to be. So I think that's also a very important point that you mentioned earlier. And we looked into the possibility of using digital solutions, but because of the lack of the digital infrastructure, especially in the Bangsamoro region, that was a challenge. So that's something that we were hoping to look forward to. With respect to the fragmented social protection programs, so I also published a research paper series at PIDS on the evolution of social protection programs only up until 2019. It was fragmented to begin with, and then it evolved. We had like 3 school feeding programs across different departments, and they eventually, united this and all this. So I'm surprised we have to do more work, but it's good that we still are looking at that. From my work on local government, so that's what I worked most on when I was with PIDS. So with respect to I worked on the Mandanas ruling. So the Mandanas ruling in the Philippines, what that did was it increased the base for the transfers that LGUs could receive. This was back in 2019. Now, what the national government is thinking is, how can you possibly, there were devolved functions back in 1992, but how can you possibly rethink the different assignment of responsibilities? And I think it's identifying which, but identifying also which should stay with the national government. So the 4-piece program actually was decided to stay with the national government. The other smaller ones for crisis, that could be the local governments that could be implementing it. For my work on budget also, that's very interesting that you mentioned that. We do have emergency response. It's for some of the agencies like social welfare and DOH and that. But it's interesting that you're moving towards really institutionalizing when there's an emergency. So in the case of the Philippines, when you declare a state of natural calamity, that already triggers the release of the funds within the budget. At the local government level, you can also do that. That would also increase assistance there. Now, going back to your question. So thank you. It's a very interesting conversation. Okay, so I'm ADB again, okay? No longer my individual self. So how can ADB, again, encourage more collaboration with our partners, private sector, and all that? So I have 3 points too, again. So ADB can strengthen its role by actively engaging governments in policy dialogue, sustainable capacity building, which we are doing through our TA. We're currently revising our technical assistance approach, and we're thinking of how we can institutionalize capacity building for governments. Leveraging private sector investments, we are also currently reviewing, especially at the board level, our approach for private sector development through blended finance and innovative mechanisms, fostering deeper collaboration with other MDBs for joint programming and impactful solutions. So we recently instituted our full mutual reliance framework Sir Babes, and that allows, if there's co-financing across with the World Bank, countries will now just have to deal with one set of procurement requirements, and ensuring that all projects are designed to withstand economic shocks and adapt to environmental challenges, promoting long-term sustainability. Second point, importantly though, ADB must sharpen its solutions it offers, based on better diagnostics, like Sir Babe says, data, in identifying and understanding each country's development gaps and challenges, allowing experience in previous ADB work, and I've always been a proponent of this, to inform the design of new interventions, and also Sir Babe said that. Have the baseline and well-designed outcomes and systems to monitor and evaluate progress. There needs to be collaboration across sovereign and non-sovereign operations within the bank, regional, country, and sector departments, especially when it comes to addressing the multifaceted nature of poverty and inclusivity, as well as uncertainty. And my third point is, it's an exciting time for ADB now. We've been so busy last week. We've had 2 deck meetings and talking about a lot of different approaches. So this year we instituted the first policy architecture. We were the only MDB that did not have this. And what this allowed was for us to review our approach to different sectors or segments. So we are currently reviewing the operational approaches to technical assistance. So technical assistance would allow for knowledge work, identifying the gaps in countries, or also capacity building of those project management units and government officials. Private sector development, we're also reviewing our approach because there's limited fiscal space in all governments, and we need to also bank on the private sector to help. But in order to do that, we need to have the regulatory frameworks and the upstream work done. And I've always been an advocate of upstream work because most of my work has been on governance. There's also regional cooperation and integration. We are looking at that as well, the operational approach. Digital transformation, just this morning we had a board seminar on this. Knowledge management, also we had an update. So these are all very critical, it's a critical juncture now for ADB. As well as upper middle income countries approach. And I think this is also very important for ADB to remain relevant, because even if they're upper middle income, they do still have development challenges. There's income inequality across this, and there are still pockets of poverty. Now, to be the partner of choice, ADB needs to articulate in these documents how they envision ADB to solve complex problems, and in an integrated manner, and clearly communicate these two. Thank you.
Totally okay. And I think having that, the perspective on the other panelists and what they have said, I think this is important, right? Because this is more supposed to be like a conversation where we can really try to find a best way to go forward, right? Especially as an institution that's really looking at poverty and with enhanced focus, as you have mentioned in the corporate results framework, we now have like a new poverty target, right? Which is really reinforcing that idea that, we are serious about poverty reduction within the Asia and the Pacific. So on that line of thought, Katie, coming back to you, and I know that you have been working with our poverty and social analysis team, right, to develop this, renewed and also much more in-depth kind of poverty and social analysis. Enhanced methodology, that's something that we've been, really trying to talk to our operations about in the past 2 years. So maybe you can just talk a little bit more to the audience about what that's like and how is this enhanced, and how will this tool help us going forward in terms of measuring?
Absolutely. So I was part of a team last November. We had a training with ADB colleagues and DMCs on the poverty and social analysis tool. And I speak as an outsider to ADB, obviously. So it took me some time to get a hang of what this tool is and how it sits within operations. But being an outsider, I can also tell you that I think it's a really valuable tool for colleagues to systematically understand how operations and the projects and programs and loans they work on have a real life impact on people in poverty and other beneficiaries or those who are affected. So one of the core components of the tool is a channels of impact matrix, which helps you systematically go through the various channels of impact. So that might be through employment or changes in prices or access to services. And to then think, well, how might different groups be affected? Who are those groups? What are those effects, direct or indirect? And if the effects aren't positive, what can be done to change that around? And how can we influence what we are doing in collaboration with governments so that it reduces poverty to the best extent possible and of course does no harm? So I think it's a very intuitive tool, it's a systematic tool, it's one that is open for people to use in the sense that if you have no background in poverty, that's fine. It doesn't need any in-depth information about poverty lines or whatever. It's very intuitive, understanding that poverty is multidimensional, certain groups will be more or less affected, etc. I also think it's crucial because we are sitting here as a group of people who have worked on issues of poverty, who have some familiarity with it, maybe social protection. But I'm convinced that if poverty reduction is left to the people who work on poverty reduction as their core part of their business, it will never happen. It is what happens across this bank in all its other parts, people who do not think about poverty on a day-to-day basis, even though it's now one of the goals, that's where most of the poverty reduction will happen in all the big infrastructure projects and the impact it has on employment opportunities or the ways in which it makes it easier to access services or not. So I think it's a crucial tool, especially in relation to what we've just heard about poverty reduction being at the heart of this organization. And for that to happen, it can't be left to the wonderful human development and poverty and social analysis team. Everybody needs to be on board. And I think that's the power of ADB as well. It was mentioned by Dr. Abetta, you have the resources, you have the engagement with the governments. These are tools, these are points of leverage that so many other partners do not have. And I think the PSA tool, coming back to that, is just one piece of that puzzle that makes ADB such a big player in poverty reduction.
Thank you. And yeah, totally agree. And I think, in terms of just the implementation of this, it's really getting the teams to see the importance of why this is at the core of what we do. But I think that's also the challenge of going from the intention versus the implementation, right? And so something I think about really a lot more nowadays, especially now that I'm in strategy and policy, and you think about, how policy is developed and the rationale behind it, and then, by the time it translates down to operations, it becomes a completely different animal from time to time. But I appreciate the panel for, we had a lot of conversation across a wide range of topics, from the information gaps to, the regional challenges, but also, specifically in the Philippines, what we're doing, what we have done, and what are some of the challenges that are that exist at this moment. So I think now I think we're up for Q&A. So, yep. Yay.
No, it's just, I didn't want to lose the thought, but it's just, thank you so much. And the panel is really, I think all of you have highlighted the importance of the multidimensional nature of poverty. And this is something that, we've not been tackling, I think, very deliberately, and I think this tool is going to be great to help us to think that. I have a question really, or a comment responding to something that Edie Justine, you mentioned, which is that many of our client countries that are in the upper middle income country status are actually grappling with a lot of issues relating to reaching the most vulnerable and the regional disparities, urban, rural, or whether it's just specific vulnerable groups. Now, one of the things that we're facing, and I'm covering a region which has several upper middle income countries, they're very eager to engage with us. However, we have consistently heard from many of our upper middle income country clients that they would really like to, explore use of concessional borrowing for activities which they consider non-revenue generating, but especially for poverty reduction and social inclusion. So this is something, maybe Lou, with you and SPD and all that, maybe this is something that as an institution we need to lobby for. A window that provides distinct funding for, not linked to, I know that there's ways to ride down on like climate, action and stuff, but really targeting social investments in upper middle income countries.
Mix. Noted.
Thank you so much for that, Sophia. That's a very, very important point. And yeah, it's nice. It's interesting to hear about that. I have one UMIC in my constituency. I wasn't going to mention.
You want concessional financing for Kazakhstan?
Exactly. So I think in the dialogue that we are doing now, there's already been an IBS for the board, informal board seminar, but there's still a lot of work to be done on that with respect to the approach for UMICs. Me, it was more for the regulatory bottlenecks that wouldn't allow some upper middle income countries to engage in certain sectors with ADB or to borrow for certain purposes. But thank you for that point, and reason.
Inclusion. I mean, the point there is like many countries in that status, we go in and they're willing to borrow for infrastructure. Well, who isn't willing to borrow for infrastructure? Because of course it leads to development and overall poverty. But then maybe being able to provide more engaged in these countries, more on the social inclusion bit, because that's what they're really struggling with. And that's where perhaps a lot of upper middle income countries fall into that trap and not able to make the jump to high prosperity society like China did, where they lifted all these people out of poverty, is because they're not able to make those investments. So that's where the emphasis on poverty and social inclusion is really needed.
Yeah, and I think, from SBD's perspective, we just need to think about the trade-offs, right? Where are these concessional resources? Where are the best use for money, right? Best value that you get. And I think this is a real question, right? Because resources, even though we have a lot, as Babes has mentioned, it's not limitless, right? And so I think we need to think a lot more sort of strategically about what we use those resources for. And are the UMICs the best approach? I don't know. Yeah. But, I was reminded to say that we have 40 folks online who are joining from a variety of countries, including Philippines, Cambodia, Pakistan, PRC, and Rwanda. So this is, I guess, open to all, right? Yeah. Other questions? But you also has a question? Oh, come on. No, that's a no.
I've been checking, there's no questions yet from the online folks live at the moment. So folks, if you're online, please feel free to put your question in. Perhaps I might ask the panel a question, if that's okay, all of you, whoever wants to answer. So I'm Louise McSorley, a social development specialist here, and I want to pick up the point that Sophia made, not about UMICs in terms of borrowing, but this issue about growing inequality, social exclusion, and then the links to perhaps civil unrest, and what is that where, if you were to think, say we solve poverty, chronic poverty, where would we be in 10, 15, 20 years? Do you see this as this exclusion, this growing gap between the haves and have-nots? Is that what you would predict ahead as being the sort of new frontier of poverty? So yes or no, or is this going to become an increasing issue? Do you see? Whoever wants to answer that.
It's an easy question, Louise. No, I think it's helpful to talk about poverty in isolation, in the sense that a lot of people experience disadvantage and deprivation, and that's a problem we need to tackle. But really, alongside that, we should also be thinking about inequality. And if poverty reduction doesn't go hand in hand with inequality reduction, or at least not widening the disparities, you'll have an issue on your hands if you don't have it already, as you're talking about, Louise. And certainly in a lot of high-income countries, this is where we see a lot of the, maybe not unrest, but polarization and just unhappiness and dissatisfaction happen. So yeah, I would advocate to throw inequality into the mix as well. But I imagine that's not always an easy conversation.
On that question?
I think that for the Philippines case, our growth and distribution analysis done by our colleague Silvia Reyes has mentioned that Philippines has been growing quite consistently, but the impact on poverty is muted simply because of the inequality issue. So that's real here. Of course, the only I can only remember things like we had when the price of rice increased a lot and people are complaining on the streets. The other one I can remember was EDSA revolution. That's a different one. So people know that it may happen. I don't know when, but that's the thing that mutes the impact of growth in the Philippines on poverty is really inequality. So that's a real issue, long-term issue in the Philippines that we have to, and what frustrates me is that many of our programs are targeted for the poor, but actually the poor is not benefiting from them. And I've been telling our programs benefiting from them. So those solutions are geared for the poor, but not benefiting the poor. That frustrates me.
We have a taker in the back.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raf. We're an SME and a foundation. We work a lot with indigenous communities, and I'm very grateful for the information that you guys shared. It would be very helpful for a lot of SMEs who work with communities to get access to. I understand though, like that ADB it's a big bank, and so SMEs like us oftentimes are too small. So I was wondering, do you have like partners that put together not just the financing, but also like the information or like the policy? It's almost like a incubator of sorts that could help the small businesses or medium enterprises that are working in the field communities. Like for us specifically, it's Aitas and Dumagat in Zambales and in the Sierra Madre region. Because I have tried to inquire with certain banks or certain organizations, and it's such a long process to get either the info or the resource, or we're too small in that sense now. And then we've had the opportunity to be in an incubator, a government incubator or a UN incubator, and it's good, but they don't have your information or resources. So just they're willing to give it though, but they can't give what they don't have. So just curious about that.
So I'll take a stab at it, but I think people from operations should be the one to answer this one. No, but we do engage, but it's through sovereign or non-sovereign. So let's say there are some countries that you can lend to for this specific purpose, and it's done through, let's say, a government bank or something that does unlend to SMEs. So this has been done, but it's more of collectively, and then the people from operations, maybe you could add on to that. Thank you.
I do think that our intervention or our interaction with SMEs are often through financial intermediation, right? And so we will give out a loan to the government, and then they will then on lend or they approach sort of the SMEs in that way. So that yeah, you're right. Like in terms of just direct kind of lending, I mean, I can imagine that PSOD or our private sector operations at one point or another would be more interested in having that conversation, right? Especially with with SMEs that are promoting a certain type of services or but I can tell you that having you stand, yeah. I can tell you that a lot of the times the envelope is too small, right? Because for an institution like ADB, you'll spend the same amount of resources, whether it's like $100 million or $5 million. Right? And so that's kind of our trade-off when we have like a constraint in terms of resources, human resources, and teams. But I think that's the way that we have been addressing it. But again, there is no. I think going forward, we are thinking about new tools to really address this kind of accessibility, right? And our reach in terms of ourselves as a bank.
Good afternoon. On the matter of defensible wealth distribution via much sought after universal basic income. There's this school of thought that it is ultimately revenue investment, since it will physiologically strengthen productivity base. How would MDBs vis-a-vis national development strategies sort this out strategically and logistically? UBI as revenue investment, ultimately.
Exactly.
Yeah, that could be a wholesome.
But I'm not ADB. I'm a policy researcher now. Actually, this also pertains to Sir Babe's point with respect to targeting, especially when it comes to social protection programs. There is limited fiscal space. Well, at least I know I know the Philippines well. So at least from the perspective of the Philippines, if you have limited fiscal space, ideally our programs, if we're trying to address a certain pocket or population or vulnerable group, it would go that direction. I understand the universal basic income, but I haven't looked at the law again. I don't know if it's in Congress. Is it still in Congress? We're not sure. But it's just like, I'm not too familiar with this, but again, my point is with limited fiscal space, ideally if it's for social protection purposes, for me personally, it should be targeted.
Okay. We just give you an example of the college free tuition. Now that's a very big problem for government to sustain. Together with that is the fact that the college free tuition is not benefiting the poor, for which it was designed for, because the poor doesn't reach college essentially. So that's the problem with untargeted ones. It's very difficult to sustain it, and very difficult to determine what its effects on withdrawal from the labor market. At which level do you set it up such that it's affordable and doesn't encourage people to withdraw from the labor market? So that's a design issue that's.
On that point, Dr. Babes, if I may, we have a whole lot of evidence from the Philippines that shows that when people get cash transfer, not only do they not withdraw from the labor market, they actually are actively seeking work to an extent far larger than people who do not receive the cash transfers, who are equally poor. So there's a lot of really interesting evidence out there. And your question is a fantastic one about universal basic income, and I think it deserves a whole separate seminar. Speaking as Karen citizen, it's a fantastic idea. Everyone deserves a minimum basic standard of living. Speaking as Karen working for ADB, where our main clients are governments, it involves a lot of policy dialogue around what works and what doesn't, coming back to the evidence point that Babes made. And that importance of evidence cannot be overstated. And not only that, but the importance of communicating that evidence in plain language that everybody can understand. When our impact evaluation statisticians come and start speaking about standard deviations and statistical power, we need to communicate messages about what works and what doesn't. There are different ways of introducing kind of universal types of benefits, coming away from full universal basic income. There are universal child grants, for example. Those are very popular in many different countries. And ADB has supported a near universal child grant program in Mongolia, for example, which ends up reaching about 80% of all the households in Mongolia. So that's pretty close. But it really depends on the government and the context and the policy dialogue that we have, which has to be based on evidence. But yeah, super interesting question and topic. But while I have the mic, can I ask a question as well? There's so much to respond to in everything you've said. Thanks so much, everybody. I feel like this was a panel tailored for me because it's all the things I'm most interested in. But I'm going to hone in on one. When we come to shock responsive social protection, I think we can all agree this is where we're headed. We need to have the systems in place to be able to respond very quickly once a shock happens, right? You can expand grants to people who already get them. You can add new people to your cash transfer program. You can target people because you have a system of targeting that's ready. So that's all great after the shock has happened. But Katie, you mentioned in passing that one approach that's kind of gaining traction is anticipatory action. And I've been super interested in that lately. We're getting so much better at predicting when things are going to happen, different shocks. So anticipatory action is where you do cash transfers before the shock happens. Sounds pretty simple, but is that, I think it's gaining traction, but is it really? Do you know examples from places? I know in Mongolia, they apply it when they know a terrible winter is coming and all the livestock are going to die. They can do cash transfers ahead of time. But other examples, and shouldn't we be doing more of that?
So the last question first. Yes, I think it should be more of that because it just avoids responding to falls in people's incomes and deterioration in living standards, which is inevitably more expensive and of course also creates more uncertainty for families. I think there are promising examples across Africa, particularly in agriculture, where, for example, predictions around rain or lack of rain then trigger either cash transfers or an insurance-based mechanism that people may have been paying into or through NGOs or governments. I believe in Ethiopia, don't have the details of that, but yeah, there's certainly examples to look at that have promising results.
All right, so I've been giving the evil eye because we're literally 3 minutes or 4 minutes actually from closing. So I just wanted to, we have 4 panel members, so 1 minute each on quick reflections or last words that of wisdom.
Okay, I'll try to do it. To sustainably reduce poverty or alternatively ensure that growth is inclusive, allowing all to contribute productively and improve the quality of lives in the economy requires many different efforts from the public sector, the private sector, and from individuals themselves. But when it comes to redesigning or designing policy interventions to address poverty, there are always 2 vital questions that in my head need to be identified. And I published this before when I talked about economic principles of right-sizing government. First, what is the objective of the program? What is the gap being addressed? Whether is it a market failure or not, poverty reduction, and what will success look like? Second, who are the intended beneficiaries? How will eligibility be identified? And how would you monitor progress? I believe these concepts would also apply to the design of solutions here at ADB. On the board, we have continuously asked to link our objectives for each of the project loans to solutions and development outcomes, however challenging perfect attribution could be to our interventions. But this also requires a systematic thinking and documentation of baseline data and the idea of how each program could possibly improve. Impact evaluations are costly, we know this, and tedious, but as long as the baseline data is there, for projects, designs, work that we do here, when the time comes when we do have time for impact assessment, at least the data and information are there. Thank you.
Said, Babes.
I think I was playing with the matrix actually, so as an assignment. So I was just saying that maybe the next thing that you should be doing is fill this up with actual examples, and see where they work. But the thing that I missed is really cost effectiveness, because some are effective but very expensive. So I think you should do that. And some are effective, but that's the only thing that works. Like, for example, for extreme poverty graduation program. But for the what you call this near poor, what do you do? Does insurance work for them? What kind of so one thing I'd like to I maybe that poverty group should produce is what the education group has produced. They call it smart buys. There's a smart buys compiled by the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel, which actually ranks intervention by cost effectiveness, so that you can people can pick up and maybe it's proven in one context. Where does it fail and for what reasons? That's are the things that you. So that's I think a very very useful resource, perhaps for poverty, wherein there are plethora of solutions, but need to be validated. In situations.
Maybe I'll just add something that might not have been mentioned this afternoon, but actually it's also very important that as ADB tries to develop its poverty and social analysis framework, don't forget on the rights-based approaches. So I think there was a conference in Bangkok last year, and then there was really a good discussion on really advocating on frameworks that looks into social protection as an entitlement but not as a charity, and basically promoting dignity and agency for the recipients. I think as someone who is really doing a lot of field research, inclusivity and participation is really necessary. The agency and empowerment channel in the framework is really a good opportunity to integrate traditional knowledge and practices, as we know that social protection, when applied to different contexts, could be really different. So it really ensures that social protection is actually grounded on dignity, and of course it also addresses a lot of stigma that that comes with it. So I think that's a good addition to further discussions.
Yeah, fantastic point. Thank you.
And I'm going to add on to that because I think this is included in the PSA tool, but we've heard a lot about evidence. We need to talk to, consult with, and work with people in poverty. So ideally, in the next session like this, there will be people who have lived experience. It's all good and well to have data. Yes, that's really important, but we need to understand the realities and the practical experiences to find out how does it work in practice. We went to Calauan in Laguna province last week. People were relocated from Manila into a nice new area. There were no employment opportunities. More than half of the families went back to Manila in worse conditions than they were before. I think things like that you can only really find out about when there is consultation and collaboration with people in poverty. And there's some fantastic organizations in the Philippines and across the region who can help facilitate that.
Well, now we're officially out of time. I come away with a lot of inspiration, but also a lot more questions. So I think this is really an opportunity for more debate. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everybody on the panel for coming and really sharing with us your thoughts and insights, which I'm sure we really appreciate as a group. So thank you. A round of applause.